Got it.
We're going to wait a couple more minutes till everybody from the waiting room can actually enter the meeting. I think we're ready to begin. Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you for coming, especially today. I know that the GSA is happening as we speak, so I know we have stiff competition today, but so thank you all the more for those who did come today. Today is our conversation with Iliya Troyanov. My name is Elisabeth Krimmer. I'm the co-organizer of this series, together with Deniz Göktürk from UC Berkeley. Deniz, do you want to wave briefly? I can't see her in the thing, but I assume she
Hello,
is.
hello. I'm here.
Hello. Okay. This is the first event in fall, but we have two more scheduled, and I would like to announce the dates for those. We have an event on October 22nd with Sasha Stanisic, and we have one on November 19th with Olga Grasnova. So if you can, please come to those two. I also have an announcement about an event that is actually sadly not happening, namely the Mossy lecture that Troyanov was going to give at Berkeley that unfortunately had to be canceled, but will happen next year. Before we begin, I have a number of people and institutions that I would like to thank because they made this series possible. In particular, I would like to thank the German consulate in San Francisco for its generous financial support. She said not to use names, but I want to single out Elena Sims for everything she's done for the series. I also want to thank the Pacific branch of the German Historical Institute, and in particular, Heike Friedman and Ray Ward, because they've handled all Zoom-related matters for us. And without them, we would be Zoom bombed and suffer from other technical problems. So thank you both. Our guest today is Iliya Troyanov. He was born in Sofia, Bulgaria in 1965. In 1971, his family fled through Yugoslavia and Italy to Germany, where they gained political asylum. Excuse me. A year later, the family moved to Kenya and lived in Nairobi from 1972 to 1984. Interrupted by a 3-year period in Germany. Excuse me. Iliya Troyanov later studied law and ethnology in Munich, and in 1989 founded the Marino Publishing House, which focuses on African literature. In 1998, he moved to Bombay, and in 2003 to Cape Town. Herr Troyanov has published 20 books in different genres, including novel, travelogue, reportage, and political essay. Several of these books have been translated into English, including Die Welt ist groß und Rettung, lauert, überall, Die Versuchungen der Fremde, unterwegs in Arabien, Indien, and Africa. And I want to mention, especially for those who like sports, Meine Olympiade, ein Amateur, 4 Jahre, 80 Disziplinen. Today, we're talking about these 2 books, Nach der Flucht and Der I wanted to introduce this, Der Weltensammler, his most popular book and also the one that's been most translated into 30 languages. Today, we're talking about Nach der Flucht and EisTau. Iliya Troyanov is in conversation with Chunjie Zhang today. She's an associate professor of German at the University of California, Davis. She's the author of the 2007 book, Transculturality and German Discourse in the Age of European Colonialism. Please join me in welcoming Iliya Troyanov.
Hi, hello everyone. It's my great pleasure here in Vienna and to talk to Iliya in person. So it's a very special thing for me, especially we're still in the pandemic, and I traveled yesterday from Berlin to Vienna and to meet him. So yeah, it's something not only special in the pandemic, but special in life at all. So without further ado, we would like to start the event, and the structure, it will be reading, discussion, reading, discussion, reading, discussion. So first, Iliya is going to read from the first part of this book, and then we'll have a brief discussion, and then he will read some from the second part of the book, and then we'll have a discussion, and then we're going to briefly talk about this book, The Lamentations of Zeno, and then we'll have open Q&A session. All right, please.
Oh, good morning, good evening, good night, everyone. Nach der Flucht, this is the beginning of the book in German. Erster Teil von den Verstörungen. Die Flucht rechtfertigt sich selbst, das Leben danach stellt immer wieder neue Fragen. Nichts an der Flucht ist flüchtig, sie stülpt sich über das Leben und gibt es nie wieder frei. Stets wird der Geflüchtete vorgestellt als einer, der von woanders kam, der spät in einer Winternacht in den Gasthof trat, der nicht eingeladen war, ein Mündel, dem ein Teller Suppe vorgesetzt wurde, weil es sich so ziemt, egal wie viele Jahre seit seiner Flucht vergangen sind. Die Einheimischen kennzeichnen ihn als jemanden, der etwas Essentielles nicht mit ihm teilt. Selbst die kürzeste Biografie hat Platz für seine Bindestrich-Identität. Ob es daran liegt, fragt er sich, dass er immer noch in seiner Muttersprache zählt? Einschulung. Er kann einige Wortbrocken, seine Mutter kann einige Wortbrocken. Gemeinsam stehen sie am ersten Schultag vor der Tür der Rektorin. Sie haben sich verspätet. Klasse 1b, sagt die Rektorin, im zweiten Stock. Sie deutet nach oben, eine breite Treppe. Als sie in den Gang biegen, wird eine Tür zugeschlagen. Die Mutter klopft an die Tür. Herein! Ein Raum voller Kinder in seinem Alter. Er beginnt sich zu schämen. Die Rede seiner Mutter, ein Radebrech. Er kann es nicht besser. Nein, 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 wehrt die Lehrerin mit beiden Händen ab. Ich habe schon 4 Türken in meiner Klasse. Und scheucht Mutter und Sohn davon. Die Treppe hat beim Hinabsteigen mehr Stufen. Er weiß, was passieren wird. Sie werden wieder zur Rektorin gehen müssen. Er schämt sich noch mehr. Die Rektorin erhebt sich, sie marschiert durch den Gang, die Treppe hinauf, den oberen Gang entlang zur Klassenzimmertür. Sie reißt die Tür auf und spricht ein kurzes Wort. Er setzt sich in die letzte Reihe. Weil er wenig versteht, schaut er sich verstohlen um. Wer wohl die 4 türkischen Kinder sind? Jeder Geflüchtete kommt auf seine Weise an, manche am Morgen nach der Flucht, andere in jenem Augenblick, da ihnen die Einbürgerungsurkunde überreicht wird, manche immer wieder, andere nie. Bei seiner Mutter geschieht es an jenem Tag, an dem sie wieder Gastgeberin sein darf, an dem Abend, an dem sie zum ersten Mal im Neuland jemanden empfangen und bewirten kann. Nicht andere Geflüchtete, die Geschichten tauschen wie Zigaretten, sondern Einheimische, die sie ohne Absicht und frei von Zweck kennengelernt hat. Sie hat sich überwinden müssen, sie einzuladen. Sie kratzt das Geld zusammen für ein Mahl, das den bescheidensten eigenen Ansprüchen genügt. Sie stürzt sich in die Gelegenheit. Sie ist gänzlich anwesend. Sie vergisst für einige glückliche Momente die grammatikalischen Fehler, die ihr beim mühsamen Scherzen unterlaufen. Strahlend tischt sie ihre Ankunft auf. Die Frage, wo kommst du her, wird erst dann unverdächtig sein, wenn ähnlich oft gefragt wird, wo gehst du hin? Ah, Sie sind Rumäne, Äthiopier, Perser, Albaner, Vietnamese, Ungar, Pakistaner, Mali, Afghaner, Marokkaner. Da war ich mal, ja, im Urlaub, ist schon einige Jährchen her. Am Schwarzen Meer, am Roten Meer, in der Steinwüste. Schön ist es bei mir, hat mir gut gefallen, richtig gut. Die Trauben, Feigen, Tomaten, Orangen. Lecker, was waren das für Trauben? Gibt's bei uns gar nicht mehr, so saftig. Und der Schnaps, ich sag Ihnen, so einen Schnaps habe ich nie wieder. Es fühlt sich fast unanständig an, diese Menschen zu unterbrechen. Aus diesem Land bin ich geflohen. Von woanders zu sein, sagt wenig aus. Von hier zu sein, genauso wenig. Gelegentlich begegnet der Flüchtling Menschen, die Angst vor ihm haben. Er würde sie gern berühren, ihren Arm ergreifen oder seine Hand auf ihre Schulter legen und ihnen zuflüstern, aber ich bin doch derjenige, der Angst hat. Ich bin vor einer Angst geflohen, der man nicht entkommen kann. Ich bin derjenige, der alles verloren hat. Ich bin allem schutzlos ausgeliefert. Nicht einmal euer Vermögen ist so sehr gefährdet wie mein Leben. Irgendwann, wenn er sich hineingehört hat, wie seine Zunge gedehnt und sein Geist gekrümmt hat, wenn er nicht mehr aus seiner eingefleischten Sprache in die Phantomsprache übersetzt, sondern den Kaffee bestellt, ohne nachzudenken, wie eine Tasse Kaffee, korrekt bestellt wird. Irgendwann, wenn er den Unterschied zwischen heiß, heißen und Verheißung verstanden hat, gilt der Geflüchtete als Sprachwechsler. Das gemahnt an Geldwechsler, unausgesprochen der Argwohn, dieser Mensch habe einen schlechten Kurs erwischt, den Reichtum seiner mütterlichen Sprache eingetauscht in eine schwäche notierte Fremdwährung oder umgekehrt und zudem teuer Kommission bezahlt. Aber was hat er gewechselt? Die Schuhe, die Kleidung, die Adresse, die Haarfarbe, vielleicht den Musikgeschmack? Nicht aber die Sprache. Man kann die Sprache nicht wechseln. Man kann sie bestenfalls adoptieren. Manchmal beschleicht ihn das Gefühl, seine Kindheit sei in der Muttersprache eingeschlossen und er müsse aus der Kindheit in eine Fremdsprache übersetzen, ohne Wörterbuch. Er betrachtet sich selbst auf einer Schaukel unter einer Glocke, es schneit und auf seinen Händen schmelzen die Flocken. In einer anderen Sprache nacherzählt, kommt es ihm vor, als sei sie nicht mehr seine Kindheit, sondern ein Mumenschanz mit lauter stummem Ahn.
Right. Thank you very much. It's beautiful, beautiful. Not only to read it on myself, but also to hear the writer read it himself. So you announced at the beginning of the book that you were inspired by the image of the American artist Jacob Lawrence. So here we see like one picture, one image out of the like the series of pictures Jacob Lawrence has painted. So could you like comment briefly on the relationship maybe between the book and the series of images?
Well, it was a revelation to me because it was in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and the cycle of paintings is concerned with the Great Migration. So Americans leaving the South to find work in the industrial centers of the North. And I was looking at these pictures, at these paintings, and it suddenly struck me that they were rooted in a certain place, in a certain time, but at the same time, they had a lot to do with my own experience.
Mm-hmm.
And they spoke very clearly and very succulently and poignantly of experiences that were narrated to me, that I had overheard, that I had witnessed, that I had experienced in different parts of the world, in different at different times. So I thought to myself, maybe there is something like an exemplary sense of the experience of being a refugee, not negating all the differences, all the kind of the concrete biographical minutiae of the experience, but at the same time acknowledging that there is maybe something like a backbeat, that there's maybe something like a common anthropological ground that concerns everyone who's had a certain human experience of being uprooted, of being thrust into a different world, of having to reorient himself or herself. And at the same time, they spoke very loudly of one of the major issues of my writing, which is arrival. Is there something like arrival? And what does arrival mean? And is arrival an aim in itself? Or should we, as transported human beings or as transferred human beings, should we aim for a certain kind of arrival? Or are we thrust into a very dynamic process of reevaluation and reorientation that defines the rest of our lives? So this was kind of the initial idea for the book.
Very interesting. So I actually discussed this book with the graduate student last year in our independent studies. So Evan Martins, and he also wonders how, like in particular, this African American art and heritage have anything to do with their book or with your general experience. You just described that, and he also mentioned like how does like the repetition as a figure in the Black culture, or actually the image in the middle of the book between these two parts. So whether this image has a like a particular meaning for you, or it's just a random choice.
It has. The interesting thing is that I think when someone looks at this painting, of course, this is in black and white, and evidently it's in color originally. What you see are people in movement. But what you might not realize is that each family carries one suitcase. And this struck me as being very emblematic, because when we fled, we also had one small suitcase. And what interests me is what happened before this painting and what happens after this painting. What happens before the painting is that my parents spent weeks on end trying to decide what to put into the suitcase. And the interesting thing is that, for example, they put a small toy, they took a small toy with us or with them that was completely unnecessary, but it was a kind of symbol of the fact that they were going to a certain kind of quotidien, a certain kind of daily life of playing and enjoying life for their kid would continue with that, whatever happens during this very adventurous and dangerous journey. So there's so many symbols of objects that, or another very good example is that they took a small painting with them, which was rolled up, which didn't actually have a great significance. It was not particularly important to them. It was not kind of something as part of the family heritage, but it hung on the wall of our bedroom. And we lived in one room. It was an extended family, so each family had one room. And it was a kind of the picture on the wall, which signifies that there's going to be another wall that you can hang this picture on. So these were the things that interested me. And of course, afterwards, this suitcase became a kind of connection to the place that you've left and the life that you've left behind. And at the same time, it is a kind of a promise of other suitcases or of potentially filling the suitcase with something new. So basically what I'm trying to say is that when you look at a picture like this one, you actually endow it with different narratives, with different meanings, depending on what your own experience is. And to me, it was full of hidden meanings that I felt I needed to kind of expand upon.
Very interesting. So I also read like the first word in part one of this book is die Flucht, so flight, and then the last word in the second part of the book, or actually the last word of the book, is free. So if I may draw a line, like a thread between from the first word to the last word of the book is so does the flight, the refuge, actually lead toward freedom?
Well, what I'm trying to, no, I'm not trying to say it, but what I'm trying to encircle is, to me, the fundamental question as to whether fleeing means freedom in an existential sense. What it certainly means is, of course, freedom in a political sense, evidently, especially when you're fleeing from a dictatorship or a totalitarian state. But is there a different kind of freedom in that you are potentially, as an ideal, as an utopia, no longer defined by your heritage and no longer defined by the fact that you are a refugee? Is there a way of overcoming these two determinations that, to me, have always felt slightly, well, not slightly actually, they felt kind of as foreign limitations on my own both physical and intellectual mobility. So this is the kind of freedom that I was trying to reflect upon, but it's an open question. I mean, it's not. I don't have an answer, but it's a process of trying to reflect upon what this freedom might mean.
Right. And then the first part of the book, the subtitle is Von den Verstörungen, so about the disturbances. So I mean, we kind of literary studies people, we used to kind of find out themes and topics in a book, and I think memory, for example, is an important theme. Like between the threads, between the flight and freedom, and maybe memory is in one of the suitcases you just mentioned. So you wrote, es gibt ein Leben nach der Flucht, doch die Flucht wirkt fort ein Leben lang. So and you also wrote, like, refugees make a special category of human beings. So how would you comment on these?
Well, memory, yeah. Interesting thing about memory is I actually had a really interesting discussion last week in Frankfurt with Aleida Assmann, and we were discussing this concept of multi-directional memories. And the interesting thing to me was that I think as a refugee, there's no other way of living and of remembering than the multi-directional. Okay. Because number one, the memories you have are conserved in a very unnatural state of kind of a static inertia. Normally, when you're living within a society that has been in you and you've been in the society for years and decades, they are constantly retold. You have variations, you have additions, you have corrections, you have personal mythologies that they're transformed into legends and retellings and so on and so forth. But when you are a refugee, it's kind of like a shut case, because no one else that you meet is part of these memories. Thus, they are no longer part of a conversation. They become part of a personal museum. Yeah. And thus, it is, or it always felt to me, as being something that is a shadow, a fixed shadow, as opposed to a shadow that grows and diminishes throughout the day according to the sunlight. So this static encumbrance of memory, I think, is a problem, and is something that many people, for example, including my mother, suffer from, that these memories become basically, they die in a sense, because a memory that's not constantly retold and evaluated at a certain point becomes like a mummy. On the other hand, you are asked about certain aspects of your past, but only certain aspects. So the interest of the people who don't know the place you're coming from is always one which has certain specialized areas of interest, which I find very telling. Certain questions are never asked, and certain other questions are always, which means that you have a certain, as you say in German, fremdbestimmt, alienated hierarchy of memory, which is not organic. It's kind of very much dependent on how the host society reacts to the memories that you carry within yourself. And the interesting thing is that this never ends, which is one of the reasons why I wrote the book, because people might assume that I was 6 when I fled. I know people who were 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, doesn't matter. Our experience is very, very similar. And it became even more interesting when the book came out, because I was approached by people after readings who had a completely different experience. For example, something that happened several times, elderly German ladies and gentlemen who left certain formerly German parts of Eastern Europe after the end of the Second World War, so-called Vertreibung, and who had thus gone from a German-speaking part of Europe to another German-speaking part of Europe, and who had lived for 70 years now in West Germany, and yet they told me that they completely identified with the book and that they had a very similar experience. So it seems to me that it's a kind of skin, it's a kind of second skin that is difficult to get rid of, that truly accompanies you throughout the rest of your life.
Absolutely. And so you also mentioned language. I think also, I mean, as a writer, language is of course a very important medium for you. So so you wrote like it is difficult to accept innocent compliment, as you also just mentioned, and you also write about Angelo Soliman, the famous African in the 18th century Vienna, who served at court and was very erudite and well respected. But after his death, and he was skinned, and his skin was displayed in a museum, and it's gruesome stories, very disheartening. So, so do you think that all these multiplicity of language actually is something emotional? Are they the carriers of different difficult emotions with people will, like as refugee would never get rid of, and that also kind of makes the special category of refugee?
Well, I think number one is the most important thing is that you find your own language. And I think one of the reasons why there's such an interest, not only in academia, but also among the reading public, in authors that have this kind of background of multiple influences and multilingual and cosmopolitan backgrounds, is that we are forced to find our own language. Thus, we are forced to expand on the existing German so that, as you say, these particular emotions and experiences can be expressed in a language that has become a host, a friend, a lover. But at the same time, there's always a sense of, there's this really beautiful German word, Fremdeln, which I think is difficult to translate, which means that there's a certain form, estrangement sounds quite harsh in English. It's probably that the translation Fremden sounds very, very sensual. And yet, at the same time, and the beautiful thing about Fremdeln is you can only Fremdel with something or someone if you already have a relationship. So it's on the basis of an existing relationship that you, at the same time, feel a certain difference, distance, alienation. And in order to express that, you need to kind of work on your own language. You have to come up with your own language, which I think is basically what the book is trying to do, to find a language that expresses this particular experience. And what you realize is that certain aspects of the German language are not satisfactory. So just to give you one concrete example, you have a German word called Heimkehr, which means homecoming, very simply. At the same time, Heimkehr nearly always has a positive connotation. And I thought to myself, it actually does not describe adequately what most refugees experience when they return home after a long period of time. For very many refugees, very good example is the former people from the former Eastern Europe. They went back after 10, 20, 30, 40 years. I know people who went back after 50 years for the first time. They didn't experience Heimkehr. The word would have been Heimkehr, but they didn't experience Heimkehr. What they experienced, and I had to find an adequate word, was Fremdkehr, which means is they are going back, but they're going back as foreigners. So these are the kind of things you have to come up with in order to have a precise description of the peculiar emotional landscape of this experience.
Absolutely, yeah, beautiful. So refugees as a special category of human beings are not only carriers of multi-directional memories, but also host of a new type of language that transmits special emotions that is not quite commonly kind of shared. And why don't we, I mean, in terms of time, in the interest of time, why don't we go to the second part of the book, and then we can talk more about freedom later.
So the second part of the book is titled Von den Errettungen. That's another beautiful thing about German, that you have the word Rettung and then you have the word Errettung. And you could probably write quite a long philosophical essay about the difference between Rettung and Errettung. It's quite fascinating. Anyway, here we are. Heimatlosigkeit muss nicht falsch sein. Die Erzählung der Flucht wird meist aus dem Blickwinkel des Stillstands geschrieben. So wie die Sesshaften die Nomaden nie verstehen werden, können die vermeintlich Standfesten die Fliehenden nur missverstehen. Flucht kann allein aus der Bewegung heraus begriffen werden. Der Anblick von Flüchtenden beunruhigt die Sesshaften. Menschen auf der Flucht schleppen ihr Eigentum in einem Koffer, einem Rucksack, einer Plastiktasche, auf Schubkarren. Ihr ganzes Hab und Gut, wie der sesshafte Volksmund zu sagen pflegt. Aber es ist nicht ihr ganzes Hab und Gut, sondern eine eigentümliche Farce, das Wertvolle zusammengeschrumpft zu einer Einheit, die man auf dem eigenen Rücken tragen kann. Alles, womit der Sesshafte sich umgibt, wofür er sich ein Leben lang abschuftet, ist dahin und für immer verloren. Das Bild eines Flüchtlingstrecks offenbart das Überflüssige am Überfluss. Zwischen Herkunft und Ankunft erfolgt aus Sicht der Sesshaften eine bedrohliche Verrückung der Ordnungen, entsteht ein schwer überwindbarer Mangel. Ergo ist der Flüchtling ein Opfer, das unweigerlich Forderungen stellen, ein gefräßiges Kind, dessen Appetit wachsen wird. Wären die Flüchtlinge weniger Opfer, erschienen sie weniger bedrohlich. Aber die Wahrheit des Tages ist nicht die Wahrheit der Nacht. Flucht kann ein Akt des Widerstands sein, eine Selbstermächtigung, ein Aufbruch. Der Flüchtling kann ein Handelnder sein, ein Aktivist, ein Rebell, jemand, der sein Leben und das Leben seiner Nächsten den Klauen des Schicksals entrissen hat. Die Einteilung in Unschuldige und Opfer verharmlost die Geschichte. Ein gefällter Baum wird zum Einbaum. Der Stamm ist tot, wahrlich eine Entstammung. Das Wasser durchschneiden, andernorts uferwärts. Der Einbaum kann kentern, denkt sich der Geflüchtete, niemals aber Wurzeln schlagen. Was wäre, überlegt er bei ruhigem Rundschlag, wenn die Frage sei, von den Früchten abhinge. Was für eine Identität können geschlagene Stämme aufweisen? Der Einbaum bewegt sich fort, dank Wasser und Wille immerzu fort. Der Mensch in seinem Einbaum klammert sich an sein Paddel und verteidigt sein Recht, anlanden zu dürfen, ohne dazugehören zu müssen. Er trägt den Einbaum durch die Wüste, das Gewicht der Welt auf seinen Schultern, aber er wirft ihn nicht ab, weil er weiß, irgendwo stößt er wieder auf Wasser. Er schläft in dem Einbaum wie in einem Zelt. Er sitzt in dem Einbaum und navigiert anhand des Südsterns unter dem Kiel Lavagestein, brüchige Brocken, fossile Flüsse. Selten versuchen Geflüchtete durch eine Rückkehr in das Land ihrer Herkunft das Geschehene rückgängig zu machen. An Festtagen haben sie jahrzehntelang die Gläser zum Trinkspruch gehoben: Nächstes Jahr in Jerusalem. Als der Vorhang sich wieder Besseres Erwarten tatsächlich hebt und ein neues, ein längst ersehntes Jahr offenbart, bleiben sie sitzen, schenken sich noch einen ein, reiben sich die Illusionen aus den Augen, prüfen wiederholt die Uhrzeit, legen Geduld an den historischen Augenblick, besuchen das Land ihrer Herkunft als Touristen mit einem Rückflugticket in der Tasche. Heimkehr ist der größtmögliche Kulturschock. Es wäre für alle Beteiligten besser, die Rückreise würde Fremdkehr genannt werden, nicht, dass Vorurteile auf Preziosen oder Unkenntnis auf Verwesung treffen. Nein, der Türrahmen, durch den der Geflüchtete eintritt, ist niedriger als erwartet. Die Beule am Kopf, das erste Souvenir der Fremdkehr. Alles vermeintlich Bekannte erweist sich als Trug. Dem Vertrauten kann er nicht trauen. Als wachte er neben einem Nächsten auf, der sich über eine lange Nacht hinweg so sehr verwandelt hat, dass er vor Entsetzen aufschreit. Seine Mutter, sein Vater machen sich Sorgen über ihr fehlerhaftes Deutsch. Es mag hier und da grammatikalisch nicht korrekt sein, sagt er, aber alles, was ihr sagt, ist verständlich. Welcher von den Einheimischen, mit denen ihr regelmäßig verkehrt, beherrscht eine andere Sprache so gut wie ihr seine? Aber was ist mit unserem Akzent? Fragt die Mutter, fragt der Vater. Der Akzent ist die Handschrift der Zunge. Stellt euch vor, wir redeten alle wie Nachrichtensprecher, wie Überbringer schlechter Botschaften. Der Akzent sorgt für die Schönheitsmale auf der Sprachhaut. Heimat ist die widersprüchlichste Landschaft der Literatur. Es lebe kulturelle Bewegungsfreiheit. Heimat existiert nur als Plural, wird sprachlich aber meist im Singular verwendet. Erst wenn er sich von den Zuschreibungen der Herkunft und den Zumutungen der Ankunft losgelöst hat, ist der Geflüchtete wirklich frei. And to end the book, ein Zitat von einem Heiligen, ich glaube des 11. Jahrhunderts, Hugo von St. Victor. Wer sein Heimatland liebt, ist ein zarter Anfänger. Wem jeder Fleck so viel bedeutet wie der heimische, ist stark. Vollkommen ist aber jener, dem die ganze Welt ein fremdes Land ist.
Yeah, thank you very much. Beautiful. So you just, when you started the reading of the second part, you mentioned the word Rettung, Rettung. So I actually looked up the word, I mean, in etymologisch, etymologisch is German, sorry, I'm in Germany, so, or I'm in German-speaking Central Europe. Etymologically speaking, exactly, the word has the original meaning to loosen something, you know, to set free, to let go of something. So the second part of the book is to let go. So do you want to let go something? I feel, right? And so before I go to this emotional or psychological level, so I would like to comment on the structure as a kind of a structural let go, right? So the first part start with from 1 to 99, and then the second part start from 99 to 1. So but it never starts with zero. It also never comes back to zero. So why do you have this mathematical precision and also the perfect match in each part?
Well, it's a wave. It's the tide. It's also gaining and losing. It's up and down. So it's a kind of natural process. At the same time, it's arrival and distance. It's getting closer to something and then realizing that maybe you're too close, too comfortable. There's too much understanding, too much clarity, and maybe you have to step back and withdraw into the realms of uncertainty. And so, to me, the great question is, if you ask about letting go, to me, the great question is whether we don't overestimate the importance of understanding as opposed to allowing for the beauty and maybe also the existential necessity and importance of things not being understood. And by understanding, I mean understanding very much in the Cartesian sense, kind of, the very rational, because part of these experiences, I think, cannot be understood in such a clinical sense. Comfort level with not being able to understand things, of not feeling the necessity to decipher everything, is to me an ideal of becoming free. Basically, to put it very simply, would you prefer to be in a bus where you understand everybody, or would you prefer to be in a bus where you understand no one? And I would actually prefer to be in the bus where I understand no one, if those were the only two options. And I would probably feel comfortable not understanding anyone. And the reason being is that there is another way then of approaching this area of misunderstanding. Well, it's not misunderstanding. No, that's the wrong word. This area of ignorance is not the right word either. You see, I've not written about this, so I have to look for the words. Anyway, I'll look for them, and next year I'll tell you what my exact answer is. But it's very much a question of letting go, which in my kind of my process of understanding these issues was influenced very much by my 6 years in India. And an intense reading of the old Indian philosophical texts, where, of course, as probably most of you know, letting go is of supreme importance. And it seems to me also very much adequate to the experience of the refugee, who basically starts his new life by letting go of everything, often under duress, stress, distress. But at a certain point, this letting go, which maybe at the beginning was, like in our case, one of political necessity, of force, of war, and so on, so of horrible things, but maybe that can be transformed into a kind of philosophical attitude that you would not then insist on gripping something, but you would have a kind of open-minded, dynamic life of reorientation and reapproaching the unknown. And if that were to define the rest of your life, maybe that would be as close to my ideal state of mind that I can express.
Right, yeah. I mean, I kind of have the feeling or read it the way is like, I mean, there are a lot of problems and disturbances, in the life of a refugee. And as we can also read in other refugee novels and refugee literature. So my understanding is like the problems accumulates, 99 problems. So then what should we do with them? Then we unpack them, dismantle them. So then we come from this high level of distress and, and down to the level of personal freedom. So I feel like, is it a kind of a change of mindset, change of psychology? Is it like a development of self-love? It's a development of an alternative identity for being refugee as a special category of human being.
Yeah,
You just
Heimat,
mentioned, yeah.
Heimat, as I said, is should be used in plural. Of course, in German, it's a word that's normally only used in the singular. I think the same holds true for identity. I have great difficulty accepting the word as without a plurality. So if one were to use the expression as shifting identities or imprecise identities that are potentially constantly moving, I might use the word, but otherwise I have a great problem in trying to me can never be fixed in a certain time or space as an immovable object. It's to me the process of dynamically reassessing existence is the only that's a very now personal statement. I'm not making this into a general law or wish or whatever. It seems to me personally to be the only adequate reaction to the fact that I became a refugee at an age where no one asked my opinion. I was not involved in the process. So therefore, I justified that particular most important rupture in my life by then refusing to ever go back to something that is so fixed and so static as the existence before we became refugees.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we also go back to the title of this event is Confluences, right? So you also, right in the second part of the book is there are two rivers in South America and the Rio Negro and Rio Solimões. And then at first they don't interact, they don't integrate, but then in the end they do integrate and then turn into the river of Amazon.
Yeah, it's quite amazing. It's near Manaus, and so in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, and it's the only place, as far as I know, on Earth where two rivers. There's a confluence of two rivers, and the two rivers are so different in every aspect that they do not merge for about 20 kilometers. And actually locals then take you on a boat and you are exactly on the border between the Black and the White River. And it seems that black and white can never mix. And then I thought to myself, if I were to live in a village on the banks of this part of the river, I would actually claim that it's impossible for the Black and the White River to ever mix. However, after 20 kilometers, for whatever geological, aqua, whatever reasons, they do merge. So if I were to live 20 kilometers downriver, I would say, what nonsense. Of course they merge, they've become one river, and actually I don't even remember whether they were two different rivers. Are you sure they were two different rivers? I mean, now they're one river. Who can actually prove that they're two different rivers? No one has gone upriver. I mean, we all go downriver, and downriver, it's one river. So these are basically questions of perception in time. I mean, we've written in the book Confluences that everything that is defined as tradition or canon, nothing else but a confluence that has been forgotten. Basically, everything that we claim as static, and basically the whole idea of national culture, national identity, and all that, to me, nonsense. Is nothing else but a forgotten confluence. And once you start going upriver, you see so many different confluences that basically you understand that the whole kind of the whole cultural development of humanity is one of ongoing confluences. And then that can be translated into a personal attitude, position, and aspiration.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we still have a little bit of time, then we talk a little bit about Zeno. I mean, if this book, Nach der Flucht, is maybe like psychologically positive book, because it's in the end about free, about let go, about personal freedom, liberation. So then, but Zeno is actually a tragic book. I mean, in the end, the protagonist, Zeno, as the scientist on a cruise ship, sink the ship and commit suicide. So yeah, in the climate of today's discussion, yeah, heated discussion on climate change and environmental crisis. So yeah, why this very pessimistic view? Even though I mean, on the refugee side, you have rather a positive attitude.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure the book is pessimistic, but the main character.
That's right.
The main character is very pessimistic. Absolutely. No, I thought to myself, how, I mean, basically the first question was, how do you write about climate change? And it immediately occurred to me that the only way I could write about it is a love story. And the love story is between a man and a glacier. And then I thought to myself, okay, I mean, who would love a glacier? Evidently, a glaciologist. And then I visited a few of them, and my inkling proved to be correct. They do have, those are scientists that, of course, work with all the parameters of scientific evaluation and discourse, but at the same time, they identify very strongly with a glacier, because a glacier is something incredibly beautiful. It is, by the way, constantly changing. It's moving. It's actually flowing on the melted ice on the bottom, where it rubs across the mountainside. It is very unique. Each glacier is unique. It actually has its own, again, a German word I made up, Hörbild, which means its own acoustic representation, or I don't know how to translate it, which means that actually, if you are very well acquainted with a glacier and someone else were to record the sounds it makes, you would close your eyes, you could actually pinpoint which glacier it is.
Oh, wow.
And then I thought to myself, okay, what happens to a man like that who loves his glacier and the glacier dies? Which is not an academic question, it's happening all around the world. And in some places they have already died, and in other places they will die soon. And even in the Alps, they are shrinking at an incredible speed. And that was kind of the initial idea. And if so, it's not a political kind of starting point. It was very much a very poetic and emotional starting point, because all the pessimism is, I think, a logical result of someone experiencing that his beloved has been murdered, has been massacred, has been destroyed. And then it's, I think, quite easy to imagine the pain, the frustration, and at the same time, around people who are ecologically sensitive had enormous difficulty in explaining this kind of strong emotional attachment to nature, or to certain aspects of nature, to people who didn't feel that way. And I thought to myself, this is part of the problem, that we have a civilization that is completely, meanwhile, alienated from nature. And at the same time, we have individuals that feel very, very strongly about certain forms of conservation of nature, or of interacting in a peaceful and non-destructive way, in a way with nature. So the next question was, how do these different people, how do they communicate? And of course, it's a conflict. And where do you place a conflict? Since Aristoteles, of course, on a ship, one place, one time, and there you have, it's a cruise ship that goes into the Antarctic,
Mm.
and you have all the ambivalences, the contradictions of our civilization between the enormous admiration that people express towards the incredibly beautiful landscape of the Antarctic.
Mm.
At the same time, the ongoing destruction. You have the enormous understanding that science has, meanwhile, as to how the oceans, ice, all these things, how they function and how um, and at the same time, a lack of solidarity, responsibility, and commitment towards preserving this thing that we understand better than ever before, and that we, on one level, rationally know we have to preserve, and at the same time, we're incapable of the transformation that would be necessary to preserve it. So basically, as you can see, this has to be a tragic story. I mean, there's no other way to, in literary terms, that
Right.
I mean, the happy end, hopefully, is what mankind will write. But the conflict is very much one of tragedy.
I see, I see. And my last question, so if we connect these two books together, so I know you're working on at a utopian novel. So is utopian ideas, or is utopia the new home? And also, I mean, why and how could utopia have such a power of salvation for the refugees and also for the humanity in general, for all of us today in this crisis of climate change?
Well, having spent now several years thinking about this, I'm completely convinced, meanwhile, that one of the greatest weaknesses of our contemporary civilization is the lack of utopian visions, both on the personal level as well as global mankind, as economy, as interaction, as forms of mutuality and collaboration, and so on and so forth. There is a kind of cynical pragmatism that defines most aspects of both our discourses and the way we act. So I truly believe now that we need an infusion of utopian thinking, not as a blueprint. I'm not suggesting that we define a utopia, agree upon it, and then use that as a blueprint for transformation, but as the liberation of future. I think utopian thinking is the only way we can liberate the future into multitudes of possibility and multitudes of alternatives. And as long as we have this completely morbid, destructive belief in there's only one system and there's only one way of organizing society, economy, and so on, I truly believe we're doomed. We need utopia to expand into the unknown that will allow then radical transformation that I think is necessary for survival.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. So now I think, yeah, we could open up the Q&A session, and
Yes.
yeah, please feel free.
Yeah, we wanted to be sure we have time for the audience to ask questions. People are free to put questions in the chat. Maybe until we get questions, maybe I'll ask a question. The title, as you know, is Archives of Migration. And I was curious about what archives informed nach der Flucht. You explain that you deal with some autobiographical experiences, but there are also clearly stories from elsewhere. Is this based on conversations? Is it based on newspaper reports? You also, you use a lot of different genres. So I'm curious as to what went into it.
Yeah, basically research in the oral archives. So yeah, mostly speaking to people observing people, interacting people. It occurred to me at some point, maybe that's not surprising, that quite a number of people I know have a similar background. So there were quite a number of people that I already knew that I could talk to, and of course also reading other a lot of citations also from poetry, from other texts. So it's basically the my personal archive infused with the individual archives of other people with similar experiences, with an additional sprinkling of wise books for wise people, wisely cited.
And the question of mixing genres
Any
and
other
having
questions?
aphorisms and the form you've chosen. Whoops, have we lost them? The
We
form
lost you a
you've
little
chosen.
bit.
Yeah. So I'm also curious about the form. You're mixing different genres. You have these little dramolette, you have aphorisms in there, anecdotes, little stories you tell. Was this something that was obvious to you from the beginning, that this is the kind of aesthetic form you want to choose for this particular text? Or is this something that emerged as you were working on it? And if so, why?
I had a sense that I would need diverse forms, and it became quite clear early on that to express the multitudes that I spoke of, the diverse attitudes and experiences, I would need kind of a formal equivalent in using different subgenres and different. Also, there's a certain playfulness that I thought was necessary. The topic is evidently quite serious, existential, so I thought it would be helpful to, at the same time, not negate the fact that life is also about playing with forms, with formats, with roles, with possibilities, and to express that in the different forms that I use.
Thank you. To say it again, so at this point, we're encouraging questions from the audience, and we ask you to please put them in the chat if you like. And it doesn't have to be about the two texts that we discussed today, so anything goes at this point. Meanwhile, I have another question. You use the word existential, which is really interesting to me, because when I read Nach der Flucht, there were a number of moments that you described that struck me as clearly typical of a migration or refugee situation, but also as something that really affects everybody. For example, at some point you talk, and I thought that was really beautifully put, you talk about gemeinsame Erinnerungsräume, these common spaces of memory. And you explain how when you move or when you flee, to be more drastic about, you leave behind these gemeinsame Erinnerungsräume. But it occurred to me that this is also something that really affects us all. It's if a friend dies, you lose gemeinsame Erinnerungsräume. And what that really brought home to me is a certain proximity between a refugee and a person who's never experienced any form of migration, but still has these existential experiences. And it also means that in a way, the refugee is maybe much closer to us than many of us care to acknowledge. Is this something that you see as a possibility for the book, or is this existential dimension, as I call it, is this something that you feel would deny the political importance of what you write about?
No, no, not at all. Actually, that was the biggest surprise. I hadn't thought of that at all when I wrote the book. It was the biggest surprise in regard to the reception of the book that quite a number of people wrote to me saying that although they had never experienced something similar to this, they felt that it expressed parts of their own experience. For example, as you said, well, one of the examples that was often stated is that they had moved from a very small town or a village to a major metropolitan center or to Berlin or whatever, and they had felt similar things. I remember one person in Darmstadt. You remember I read this chapter in which the person who goes home after many years then hits his forehead because the door is actually much lower than he remembers. And so this man came to me after the reading and he lowered his forehead and he said, "Do you see this?" And I said, "Well, it's a beautiful forehead." And he said, "No, no, no. Ich habe hier eine Beule. I have a, what's Beule in English?"
I hit my head.
A bruise or
Yeah, okay.
Bruise.
And he said, the same thing happened to me. I left after my A levels, after Abitur. I left Darmstadt, went to Berlin, spent all my life there, came back now to look after my sick mother. And I'm hitting my head all the time in Darmstadt. Every door is smaller than I remembered, and every door is too small for me now. And this is exactly what you described. To me, it was a big surprise. I hadn't thought about that, and it was also very gratifying at the same time because it confirms, I think, something we should believe in regard to literature, regardless of how unique the experiences that you might be describing, through the beauty and the transcendent quality of literature, it can become a common existential space that we can share with one another between authors and readers and between readers themselves.
Mhm. There is a question in the
Any
chat
other
now.
questions?
There is a question in the chat from Irina Paperno. Your idea of utopian vision and its uses is most intriguing. It has occurred to me that were you to grow up in Bulgaria and another socialist country, you may have had a distrust of utopian visions. In other words, how does your most appealing idea relate to the disillusionment with utopia we suffered in the collapse of the communist idea? Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, sure. Because of course I've been discussing this question with many other people who are also from Eastern Europe. I think
From
that,
China.
or from or from China, or from many other places in the world.
Socialist
Yeah.
country. Yeah.
I think that I don't think that what we experienced. I'll speak about Bulgaria because it makes things simpler. What we experienced in Bulgaria was in any way a utopian society, not even in the planning. It was very much a society that quickly extended all the negative aspects of previous societies. In the case of Bulgaria, it was a fascist regime before the communist before the Red Army came and then the Communist Party established itself. By which I mean that it was a continuation of hierarchy. It was a continuation of an elite dominating the policy. It was a continuation of exploitation. It was a continuation of ecological destruction. It was a continuation of the patriarchy in many respects, not in every respect, but in many others. It was a continuation of authority, of misuse of power, of violence, of prisons, of Gulag, and so on and so forth. So none of these things actually occur in any serious utopia. So basically, I think the utopian aspect was very much an empty rhetoric that no one believed. I remember I lived in Paris in the 80s for a while, and there were loads of immigrants, political immigrants from Eastern Europe. And I remember someone, I think it was either a Czech or a Polish intellectual, saying very wittingly, well, the only people left who believe in communism as a utopian idea are at the Sorbonne, um, at the university in Paris, but certainly no one in Eastern Europe believes it. So I think the question is the problem of dictatorship or totalitarian statehood, is it a problem of overreaching utopian thinking, or is it the problem of not taking utopian ideas seriously at all? And this is probably what one needs to discuss. I think that when you look at the progressive history of mankind, none of the great things we've achieved would have been possible without utopian thinking. To give you one example that I found very intriguing is my daughter lives in Switzerland, and a few months ago we were together in Zurich, and we went to an exhibition that actually carried utopia in the title. And the utopia at hand was the fact that it took the Swiss society about 100 years until women everywhere in Switzerland were allowed to vote. It's actually the last country in Europe which, in certain so-called cantons, and the exhibition was brilliant because it showed how, in the beginning, the idea that women would be allowed to vote was completely vilified as ridiculously utopian. And they had a number of absolutely fascinating political campaign ads from the 1920s until the 1960s and 70s, which basically ridiculed the idea as so ridiculous and so impractical and so destructive and so on and so forth that no person who is in his right mind would ever consider it. And it was actually beautiful to look at this exhibition with a 25-year-old young, politically astute and active woman, and my daughter was just shaking her head all the time. And it was a beautiful example, because something that 100 years ago seemed as utopian to my daughter is so essentially commonplace, logical, and nothing else is imaginable, that I felt very encouraged to see how there is actually, in the long run, there is quite exceptional transformation. And it always starts with the utopian idea, always. I don't know of any great change in this mankind that didn't start with the utopian idea.
Yeah, thank you. There's another question from our colleague Sven Erik Rose. He writes, "Thank you for your beautiful texts and thoughts. Could you elaborate on how you understand or experience the phenomenon of multidimensional memory, which you said was the only form of memory refugees have?" So could you speak about multidimensional memory?
Yeah, so the term that Mark Rothberg uses is multidirectional, and I just thought that multidimensional might be slightly more adequate to my own experience, because the memories, and what I tried to describe, but probably I failed, the memories of a refugee are very much ambivalent and dependent on certain frameworks that are not your own, and they are completely, in the way they play out, completely different depending on whether there are memories of the place that you've completely left behind. I just need to add one detail. In our experience, it was a place, because we fled in 71, and no one expected throughout my youth that 89 would happen. So it was very much a closed door. It was basically, this is it, we will never go back. So the memories that pertained to the period of our lives, especially the lives of my parents before fleeing, were conserved in a state of, as I said, of being completely caught in time, of not being challenged, of not being discussed, of not being kind of refocused, realigned, readjusted. They became basically something like a narrative running gag that they were repeated. Actually, they were even repeated with the same words over and over again, because they were no longer in a fluid space of interaction. While the memories that came afterwards were very much on a day-to-day basis or continuously reassessed. People would visit us, they would add something or they would challenge something. So I felt that there were two different dimensions. There was the very one-dimensional memory space of closed doors pertaining to the experiences before we fled, and there was a very four-dimensional memory space of everything that happened afterwards. And this is very much on the individual level. Now, if you add a kind of societal level to it, and you think of the fact that, to take the German example, when you speak to people like close friends of mine who have the background of coming from Spain or from Turkey or from Syria, they then add another dimension to this memory of arriving in Germany and what they experienced after they came to this country. The interesting thing there is that there's no homogeneity. We actually have rather different and sometimes confrontational memories of the early years, of reactions to our foreignness, of entering German society, of acknowledgement or ignorance, of negative attitudes, or of warm-hearted embraces. So in a way, I think part of the discourse about refugees suffers from an effort to come up with some kind of memory strains that are clearly defined, that are narratable in a kind of political, with a political dimension, with a political direction, with a certain kind of order to them. While in my personal experience and interacting with other people who have some kind of migrational background, it is one of continuous kind of reassessment of these memories, and especially the question, how do these memories define our contemporary position in this society, and how we use them, how we instrumentalize them. At this discussion that I had last week in Frankfurt, there was a young Jewish German intellectual whose parents actually came back from Israel to Germany, who said something really, really interesting, that within the German Jewish community, there are huge differences in how people would like to remember, not only, of course, the Shoah and the aftermath, but also the way Israel or Jewish communities, be it from Germany, be it from Russia, who then came to Germany, how they would like to remember these kind of central historical facts and experiences. And these differences pertain, just to give you one example, I found that very interesting. He said, for example, that those German Jews who'd come from the former Soviet Union, that they actually would like to narrate the end of the Second World War as a victory of the Red Army. So they would focus less on the victimhood in the Shoah, and they would focus equally or even more on the victorious campaign and a kind of quasi-religious savior position of the Red Army as opposed to Nazism. So these are, I think, very multi-dimensional things that need to be. I think we need this diversity. We should not regard it as an area of unnecessary conflict, but I think as an enrichment, that the different individuals and different groups and different communities would have different focuses and narrations of important memories, which then in a kind of confluential discourse would make a multidimensional depth of memory. It's I don't think I'm expressing myself very well, but it's probably because it's quite late here. But anyway, something like that.
Okay. We have time for one last question. I would cede it to the audience, or Chunjie. I have one more question, but in case anybody else wants to ask, I'll wait a moment. No. Then, Chunjie, go ahead.
Oh, I mean, why don't you go ahead with your question? You have
I
have a question, but
it's a very general question. I'm curious, comparing German language literature with other national literatures. When I think, for example, of writers such as Kazuo Ishiguro or Sadie Smith, they're just treated as, British writers. They're not in a separate category. And I think in German literature, there is, I think, a stronger trend to create, let's call it, for lack of a better word, a ghetto of migration literature, a special branch. And the Germans are, very invested in pointing out that somebody has a Migrationshintergrund and so on. Why do you think that is? Do you think it is sort of the different histories of the countries, the different colonial histories also, or would you agree that there are differences in the way literature from different constituents is treated?
Yeah, of course there are differences. I'm just not sure what is the better option, because of course, to take the French, basically everyone who writes in French is French. So it's actually a continuation of a kind of the great mission of civilizing the world through the great benefits of Frenchdom. So on one side, of course, it's great. I mean, starting with, I think it was in 1946 that Léopold Senghor was voted into the Académie Française, because it doesn't matter whether you're black, green, white, from south to the north, as long as you speak elegant French, it is fine, you're in the Académie Française. There might be a kind of a critical way of seeing this as also a way of basically forcing everybody under the umbrella a civilization that is perceived to be superior to everybody else. I don't mind actually being called someone who, I mean, there's so many words, meanwhile, doesn't matter which word people use. If the aim is not to define a ghetto, if the aim is to point out that there are differences, and I think there are substantial differences, I don't think that anyone would dispute the fact that someone who writes in a language that he or she learned later on in life writes differently. I would actually claim that we write multilingual literature in one language, because in my head when I'm writing, the other languages always, they're like sitting on my shoulders and they're trying to interfere with my process of writing in German. So different words or expressions or idioms would pop up in Bulgarian and English, sometimes even in languages that I don't speak so well, like French, Hindi, Kiswahili, just because they feel so exact, precise, and pertinent to what I'm trying to say. And then I have to deal with that. How do I get rid of, let's say, the Bulgarian idiom? Do I translate it into German? Then sometimes it sounds very awkward, doesn't make any sense. Do I try to invent something that does not exist in German, but that in a way mirrors the particular Bulgarian expression, and so on and so forth. So I don't mind that you would use terms that would clarify that we are writing a different kind of literature, and also I don't think I don't think there's a space for us in national literature. I mean, when you look at many great German language authors of the 20th century, Paul Celan, Franz Kafka, Elias Canetti, I mean, what are they? None of these people lived in Germany, or if they did, for a very short period of time. Celan lived for a long time in Paris. Canetti lived in Zurich. Kafka, of course, in Prague. So I actually feel more comfortable in defining a space for cosmopolitan, we might call them authors, that happen to write in German. And I wouldn't want to be called a German author. I would like, whatever term is used to define me, I would like this term to express the fact that I'm not only German, I'm German, but also many other things.
Thank you. I think that was a beautiful conclusion to our event. I would like to thank everybody again for coming. And again, I know it's the GSA today, so I'm particularly appreciative that many could make it. And I want to remind you of this book, Nach der Flucht. I think it's perfect for undergraduate and graduate classes. It's a beautiful read that I think can only be characterized with the German word Sprachgewalt. So I highly recommend it. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Iliya Troyanov and Chunjie Zhang. And we hope to see you at our next event in October and November.
Thank you,
Take care, everybody.
for coming all the way.
Oh, yes. Chunjie made it all the way to Vienna.